The House will come to order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Resolution 144, I call up H.J. Res. 46 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 46, a joint resolution relating to a national emergency declared by the President on February 15, 2019.
Pursuant to House Resolution 144, the joint resolution is considered read. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves, will each control 30 minutes of time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members...
The House will come to order. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on H.J. Res. 46.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. President Trump's decision to declare a national emergency at the southern border to siphon funds for his border wall is an unconstitutional, grotesque abuse of power. An emergency declaration is not a last-ditch maneuver to employ when all negotiation attempts have failed. The House of Representatives has rejected the President's border wall, the Senate has rejected the border wall, and the American people have rejected this useless wall. The President does not get to override Congress in a raucous temper tantrum over his inability to broker a deal. The National Emergencies Act was enacted in 1976 to expedite the allocation of resources for real emergencies to save American lives and mitigate damage caused by natural disasters and acts of terror. It was not fashioned to allow a president to deny the will of Congress and the American people. Both Democrats and Republicans alike should be very concerned about the ramifications of this unprecedented executive action. It is a direct threat to the balance of power that our country was built upon and a violation of our nation's Constitution. There is also no factual basis for the emergency declaration. Immigration from the southern border has significantly decreased in the last 10 years. Any attempts to characterize the border as a crisis zone are flagrant abuses of statistics, which have shown that border crossings are at the lowest they've been in 40 years. President Trump has long proved he is not married to the truth or facts, and he has no proof to substantiate his wild claims about the status of the United States and the Mexican border. We cannot abandon our commitment to responsible governing and the truth because President Trump is outraged at his inability to fulfill a campaign promise. There's wide bipartisan support for this measure, and our democracy demands that we condemn this subversion of our Constitution and this misuse of presidential power. And with that, I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves his time. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities concerning the president. Gentleman from Georgia. Missouri, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the President clearly laid out the case for a declaration of a national emergency in his State of the Union address right here. National security is obviously the President's highest priority, and I support his efforts to build a wall. There is a crisis. There is a crisis at the border that could have been addressed much sooner and prevented. Open border policies of the last administration compounded this growing problem. We've got schools, hospitals, and other services that have become overcrowded. American workers have been hurt by reduced job opportunities and lower wages. And at the same time, human and drug trafficking has thrived. In many communities, the notorious MS-13 gang has grown. We've seen tragic cases of crimes committed by illegal aliens who have been deported not once, not even twice, but multiple times. I want to cite just one example in my home state of Missouri. A man named Pablo Serrano Vitorino was deported to Mexico after a felony conviction in 2003. He later returned to this country illegally and was arrested again in 2014 and in 2015 after several more violent incidents, and he remained in the U.S. Then in 2016, this individual who had no right to be in this country was charged for murdering 5 people in Kansas City, Kansas, and Montgomery County, Missouri. Stories like this aren't unique to Missouri, Mr. Speaker. These horrifying events are happening across this country. This is a crisis. The men and women who put their lives on the line every day to bring order and security to our borders, they deserve the tools that they need to do the job. And now this president is taking decisive action to finally address the crisis using the authority provided to him by the Congress. The National Emergencies Act is very clear. The provisions the president will use under Title 10 explicitly provide the president with the clear authority. I support the president's efforts. I believe he is well within the law in making this declaration, and I'd urge my colleagues to oppose Joint Resolution 46. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, 2.5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Speaker. About 6 weeks ago, when the rumors began that the president might declare a national emergency to build his border wall, my staff and I began working with Legislative Counsel to make sure that Congress would have a say in what amounts to constitutional cannibalism by the president. This is the most consequential vote we will take in a generation on the balance of powers between the legislative and the executive branches of government. Whether we will respect the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution, stand up for Congress and for this country and for the Constitution, or whether we will stand down in favor of the president. The precedent that may be set today, this week or next week when the Senate votes, if Congress allows this president's emergency declaration to stand, will not have ramifications only on this matter or the building of a border wall, but if the president is successful, he will likely come back for more. He will likely circumvent Congress again in the same unconstitutional way. Not only will this president do it, future presidents will do it. And I ask you this, how are we to tell a future president, if this president is successful, that gun deaths, which number in the tens of thousands, are not a national emergency, that opioid deaths are not a national emergency, that climate change is not a national emergency? This will allow a president to sideline Congress for much of domestic policy. And bear in mind, Congress over the years has already, on its own, I believe, given up a lot of its authority with respect to foreign policy. It's also clear that there is no emergency at the border. Border crossings are at a 4-decades low. The folks who are coming today are presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents seeking asylum, not trying to get around the border. There are more law enforcement officers at our border, federal, state, and local officers, than at any time in our nation's history. Since its founding, this country has become the most powerful and prosperous on the face of the earth without a border wall. That's why most Americans disagree with the president usurping the power of Congress to build his border wall. In fact, not only do they disagree with that, they disagree with using military construction money on this border project. Cities like mine in San Antonio stand to lose millions of dollars in military construction. I urge my colleagues to vote for this resolution.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. Congress explicitly authorized the president to undertake certain military construction projects that are not otherwise authorized by law when it passed the National Security Act. The president is working within the legal boundaries that the Congress gave him. With that, I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Now it's for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman from Missouri is exactly right. It is the statutes that allow this president to do this. The statutes don't provide for national emergencies on climate change. They don't allow for national emergencies on gun violence, but they do allow it in terms of this particular issue, and the president is exactly right. There is a crisis at the border, Mr. Speaker, but not only this president recognizes it, the previous President Obama in 2014 did as well when he requested $3.7 billion in emergency spending to secure the border. Where was the outrage then? Where was the outrage from my colleagues across the aisle? President Obama even went on further to say that we needed to make sure that we needed to secure our border to deter both adults and children from the dangerous journey that they embarked on. Where was the outrage across the aisle then, Mr. Speaker? It was not there. Keeping criminals out, human trafficking and drug smugglers away from our communities is paramount. Yes, indeed, we do have an opioid problem. We've actually appropriated billions of dollars to address that, and yet somehow the drugs flowing across our southern border are not a crisis. You know, again, President Obama seemed to agree with this and declared a national emergency for transnational criminal organizations, specifically calling out Mexico's Los Zetas gang, and provided more authority for ICE to actually combat that. A national emergency. Where was the outrage across the aisle then? But we don't even have to look just at the previous administration. President Clinton also declared a national emergency to go after narcotics traffickers. Mr. Speaker, I just find it just unbelievable that here today that we have got these newfound constitutionalists across the aisle wanting to rein in the president's authority. This is about defeating President Trump. I encourage a no vote on this resolution, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American people should know that there's not any statutes that would allow a president to declare an emergency to build a border wall. Not one piece of legislation would allow that. Previous presidents have declared emergencies, but they have never ventured into the legislative prerogative to allocate funding. And that's the difference that we have here. Mr. Speaker, I want to yield to the gentleman from New York and also the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler. 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, President Trump's declaration of a national emergency as an excuse to build a wall that Congress explicitly rejected is an abuse of his constitutional oath and cannot be tolerated by a co-equal branch of government under the Constitution. We must reject this unlawful power grab and reassert Congress' authority to exercise the power of the purse. The Constitution could not be clearer. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. That command reflects a fundamental principle that is older than our democracy itself. The chief executive cannot unilaterally spend taxpayers' money or redirect the budget set by the people's representatives. Earlier this year, Congress reached a bipartisan compromise to fund the government. It was signed by the President. Congress allocated limited funding for fencing in certain areas, but squarely rejected the President's request to build a medieval barrier across the southern border. Almost immediately, the President decided to rewrite the budget set by Congress, and he told us exactly why. He was not satisfied with what he got from the process that the Constitution dictates, so he did an end run and made an emergency. He and his aides have barely even tried to pretend that the so-called emergency is a real one. They know that illegal immigration is at historically low levels. They know that children and families fleeing violence are coming here to make lawful asylum claims, not as some kind of invading army. They know that illegal drugs overwhelmingly get smuggled through ports of entry, that a wall would do nothing to change that. But they refuse to let the facts and the law stand in the way of their political agenda. Even worse, the emergency law that President Trump invoked allows the military to redirect funds only if an emergency requires use of the armed forces, and those funds can be used only for construction projects that are necessary to support such use of the armed forces. But a wall cannot be possibly necessary to support a military operation on the border because our laws prohibit the military from engaging in law enforcement activities. The military cannot enforce an immigration law, so the President's actions are doubly unlawful. There is no real emergency, and even if there were, the President could not redirect military funds for a purpose expressly prohibited to the military. Unfortunately, the Constitution does not get suspended based on President Trump's preferences about what is convenient or faster. Our nation's founders left it up to all of us, including those of us in Congress, to act as guardians against exactly this type of assault on our constitutional order. In that spirit, I proudly support this joint resolution, and I call upon my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand up and do the same. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I'd yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, on the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On February 15th, the President exercised his clear authority under a clear federal statute duly enacted by Congress to use funds already appropriated by Congress for the purpose of securing our southern border. Mr. Speaker, I am glad about one thing today coming here. I am glad that for many years, the years I've been here, I've came here through the Rules Committee and others and talked about Article 1 authority. I am glad now to see that we have others who have now figured out that Article 1 probably needs to be enforced. What is interesting is selective enforcement against a president they don't like, for a purpose they don't want, for a wall that they don't want to have, because securing the border is not the top agenda for them. I get it if you don't like it, but argue with the law. The statute itself and the president's actions in accordance with it rest solidly within the separation of powers and are certainly constitutional. If you're citing the Supreme Court case of Youngstown against the president's actions today during this debate, then I suggest you haven't read the case. That reasoning of Youngstown case only applies when the president is acting unilaterally and not pursuant to a duly elected statute by Congress. Maybe the selective memory here is because the previous president actually did that when he instituted the DACA program under no things that he could have found to actually work on. Then we discussed the issue of, is there an actual emergency on the border? You know, a president once noted, he said, we've seen significant rise in apprehensions and processing of children and individuals in Central America who are crossing into the United States Rio Grande Valley areas of the southwest border. The individuals who embark upon this journey are subject to violent crime, abuse, extortion, as they rely on dangerous human smuggling networks to transport them from Central America to Mexico. Most may think that was from the current president. It was not. It was from President Obama when he was requesting more money for the emergency on the border. The problem is the factual basis is there. We sat in a hearing today in the Judiciary Committee, and I had to look at the faces of our Border Patrol agents and ICE agents and others dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, while all they get many times from this body is hate and derision when they're doing their job that we sent them to do. My problem comes back here. If we can argue about different things, this was under the law and done by Republicans and Democrats for the last almost 40 years. If you want to fix this, then you've done what you should do under law. You brought your resolution of disapproval. But if you really wanted to take Article 1 authority, then actually look at the law itself. Actually want to change it. That's what this body ought to be doing. If you don't like the fact that the president can do something, and especially my friends across the aisle who don't want this president to do anything, then fix the law. Go into this emergency declaration and say, we'll define what a national emergency is. We'll do that. They don't want to do that because they don't want to bind the hands, because they know that the law was written for a purpose that has been upheld for over 40 years. This is simply a show. It's a farce. Let's just get to the political aspect of this and say, Mr. Speaker, we don't like the president. We don't like what he's doing. Oops, we forgot about this law. And the president said, I will act under the authority given to me by Congress. You can have all the arguments you want, but at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, when you cast this vote, don't hide behind Article 1. Don't hide behind separation of powers. Go to the law and look at what the law says and vote no. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker. Can I inquire as to how much time is remaining?
The gentleman from Missouri has 22 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has 22.5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot of cries from the administration about there being a problem on the southern border with caravans loaded with people being human trafficked. And there's just simply unsubstantiated This is unsubstantiated and unfounded. There's no reports that this is happening. This is a figment of the imagination of some in the administration. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Delegate Stacey Plaskett.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The President's emergency declaration is, in fact, a power grab to go outside the bounds of the law and get what he failed to achieve in constitutional legislative process. After failing to convince the American people in Congress to pay for his ineffective, wasteful, multi-billion-dollar concrete wall, the President is now trying a desperate end run around Congress with his unlawful emergency declaration. The President's declaring an emergency over a crisis that does not exist. The statute only applies to national emergencies that require use of the armed forces for military construction projects that are necessary to support the use of armed forces. The border wall is not a military construction project. It does not require the use of the military. The immigration law is the responsibility of the federal immigration enforcement agencies, not the military. The President's declaration violates federal law, and that is the crisis. This is a crisis, a crime against our Constitution. It is an assault. It is a rape, what the President is doing now, against the Constitution, against this legislative body. I am just in another world that I, as a constitutional strict constructionist, am on this side of the aisle on an issue like this. I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I might remind my colleagues that Title 10, Section 2808 explicitly authorizes the President to change the appropriation for military construction. He is operating within the law. Right now, I would go ahead and yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, who's also the ranking Republican on Homeland Security.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Missouri. Without a doubt, there is a crisis at the border. Changing demographics have created unprecedented challenges for the Border Patrol. In the early 2000s, most illegal border crosses were young Mexican men. Today, and our laws allowed us to quickly return them back to Mexico. But today, that flow of Mexican men has been replaced with a mix of men, women, and children from Central American countries. Human traffickers are exploiting the loopholes in our laws and understand how our immigration system is broken. These smugglers tell vulnerable families that their child is like a visa to stay in the U.S. if they can just get themselves turned in to the Border Patrol. And these smugglers and their propaganda are effective. Family apprehensions for fiscal year 2019 are already 572% higher than fiscal 2013. And these traffickers don't care about the people they smuggle. The result is that immigrants of all ages are arriving on our doorstep in terrible health. Border Patrol projects a 133% increase over last year in migrants needing medical treatment after crossing the border. These changing migrant flows force our law enforcement officers to act as paramedics rather than enforcing the laws that Congress has passed. We need an all-of-the-above approach to border security, and that includes manpower, 21st century technology, and barriers. With this approach, we will deter human smugglers and others crossing hundreds of miles of open desert with innocent children. We know this approach works. In areas where we have built a wall system, such as Yuma, illegal traffic has plummeted by 95%. Let's build on this success. I encourage my colleagues to stand by President Trump's decision to use an executive authority to carry out this approach and keep America safe. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that the other side acknowledges that the people approaching our southern border are not men from Mexico, but they are families with children fleeing violence in Central America. That's an important distinction. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to my friend, the gentleman from the state of Maryland, Congressman Anthony Brown, Also, Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, 1 minute.
Gentleman's
Mr.
recognized
Speaker,
for 1 minute.
There is no national emergency on our southern border. There are no terrorists who are being apprehended. There's no invading hostile force, and border crossings remaining at a 40-year low. Pulling resources from military construction projects, as President Trump would do, projects meant to improve readiness and support our service members, impacts our national security. It will hurt military families who are already dealing with military housing with mold and lead poisoning and outdated schools and medical facilities. This declaration of national emergency will keep thousands of active duty troops needlessly deployed at the southern border and away from their scheduled training activities and operational readiness. This is a fake emergency, and for President Trump to claim we need to build a wall to support our armed forces, it's absurd and ridiculous. This emergency declaration is just an overreaching and dangerous power grab to push forward the president's anti-immigrant agenda and supposedly boost his re-election chances. There's no national emergency, only a crisis in the Oval Office. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I might point out to my colleagues just how much of a national emergency this is. And it was President Obama who recognized this, recognized a crisis at the border. In 2014, President Obama requested $3.7 billion in emergency supplemental funding for what he described as a humanitarian crisis at the border. And he specifically cited an increase in family units trying to cross the border and the lack of resources to accommodate them. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Aderholt.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to oppose the joint resolution to overturn the President's declaration. I think it's very clear that there is a national emergency that exists on our southern border because of the high rate of unchecked, unregulated illegal immigration. Illegal immigration that is not directly contributed to the flow of drugs, human trafficking, and that is directly contributed to the flow of drugs, human trafficking, and gang members into this country. Not to mention the humanitarian crisis of those who feel compelled to make this journey to illegally enter this country. I think there seems to be some confusion among many of my colleagues and maybe across the country about the action of the President. President Trump is clearly acting within the authority that is provided by Congress to confront a border security and humanitarian crisis that constitutes a national emergency. The threat to our border security is evident from the sheer number of migrants seeking to gain illegal entry into this country, and especially the number of criminal aliens in the form of cartels, traffickers, and gangs. And these people will continue to take advantage of our weak borders for their own gain. I recognize that Congress has lawfully enacted the authority for the President to use military construction funds to support armed forces to engage in accordance with the National Emergency Act. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to oppose this joint resolution at the crisis, as a crisis at the border, that it's real, and that I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friends on the other side keep invoking the mantra, Obama, Obama, even though they opposed each and every initiative that he put forward, regardless of merit. Now they want to come back and cite him for what he said and what he did. But one thing he did not do was to allocate funding that he was not entitled to. He always requested from the Congress funding authority. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from New York, Adriano Espaillat, a time of 1 minute.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Less than 2 weeks ago, after another failed attempt to establish consensus on border security funding, President Trump, a self-proclaimed master negotiator, failed to get a border wall that he originally said Mexico would pay for. So then he fraudulently invoked a national emergency declaration to rob taxpayers of funds from other programs. The president's brazen decision not only violates Congress' constitutional powers of the purse laid out in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, it's also a fabricated emergency propped up by fake statistics, racist undertones, and the blatant hypocrisy of a party that had complete control of Washington for 2 years and didn't see it fit to fund this useless medieval war themselves. By diverting funds from the military projects, the president has determined that national security takes a backseat to his political priorities. Today in the Senate, the head of the U.S. Northern Command said that border crossings do not pose a military threat. Mr. Speaker, there is no emergency. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the ranking member. I rise in opposition to this resolution. When President Trump declared a national emergency, he did so in response to the ongoing humanitarian crisis at our border and with full statutory authority vested in laws passed in this very chamber. The majority claims that this resolution of disapproval is in response to a power grab by a president acting out of line. Yet by merely disapproving of the emergency declaration, they are preserving the statutory powers they claim are inappropriate. If my colleagues across the aisle are so concerned about separation of powers, why don't they simply reform the laws in Title 10 and Title 50 that the President is using to respond to this crisis? The answer is because this resolution is not about the division of powers. It's not even about border security. The only reason this legislation is being considered on the floor today is to obstruct the President's agenda. The President has made it clear that he will use all statutory tools at his disposal to secure the border, and that is exactly what he's doing in declaring this emergency. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri has 16 3/4 minutes. The gentleman from Georgia has 18 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I will yield to the good gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Chuy Garcia. 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues make some very good points. They make convincing arguments about executive overreach and the misuse of federal funds. I thank them for those statements, and I would like to add and ask a more personal question. Since when do we call human beings in need national emergency? Have all of President Trump's other arguments failed? Is he running out of insults for people like me, people who came from Mexico to have a better life in this country? He used to call people like me bad hombres. When that failed, he turned to other insults, and after they lose its shock value, he calls us rapists, then murderers. At that point, he ran out of insults for people like me, so he referred to us as coyotes. And now, when all other labels have failed to achieve his central campaign promise to build a medieval border wall, he calls people like me a national emergency. We must reject this premise and the presence of people like me in this country, of people like my constituents in my district, a national emergency. I yield back my time.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities concerning the president. The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today because we must secure our border. We are in the midst of a national security and humanitarian crisis on our southern border, which must be addressed. Earlier this month, Congress secured important and necessary funding to protect over 55 miles of our most dangerous border, where it has been so desperately needed. We have also provided funding for over 600 new border officers. This was a good step in the right direction, but as we see again today, our colleagues from across the aisle remain unwilling to address our intensifying border crisis. With the National Emergency Declaration, President Trump is taking the steps our country needs to stay safe and secure. Yes, this is an emergency. Cartels, human traffickers, and drug smugglers take advantage of our weak border for their own gain, and it must be stopped. We need to stop traffickers from bringing young girls and women into our country where they are sold into prostitution and slavery. As a mother and a grandmother, this breaks my heart. We need to stop violent gangs like MS-13 from entering our cities and bringing their violence and evil onto our streets. And we need to stop
The time of the gentlewoman has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will now yield to the gentleman from New York, Hakeem Jeffries, 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished gentleman for yielding. I rise in opposition to this so-called declaration that is anchored in a phony, fraudulent, and fake national emergency. There is no crisis at the border. There is no basis in law or in fact for this unconstitutional emergency declaration. Illegal border crossings have not increased, they have decreased. There is no evidence of increased criminal activity on the border. There is no evidence of increased drug trafficking on the border. There is no evidence that terrorists are pouring in to the United States of America on the southern border. This is a fantasy made up by a xenophobic administration to support a medieval border wall that this Article 1 Congress rejected. That's why House Democrats will work to defeat it. Vote yes on the resolution of disapproval.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend from Missouri as I want to share my thoughts on this purely political effort by the new Democrat majority. Mr. Speaker, the U.S. and Mexico border is 2,400 miles long. My home state of Texas is half that border, 1,200 miles. Texans know something others in this chamber apparently don't know. We are at war on the southern border with the drug cartels. I say it again, we are at war on the southern border with the drug cartels from Mexico. The drug cartels are at the heart of every single problem we have on our southern border. They have a war going with our families, our kids, our schools, with record numbers of heroin, cocaine, and deadly fentanyl. The drug cartels are at war with our moral values by financing modern-day sex slaves or forced laborers. All of Texas, 254 counties, from Amarillo to Texarkana to Beaumont to Brownsville to Marfa, are impacted. They are at war with these drug cartels. The majority had better wake up and have no more figments of imagination. It's time to put politics aside and admit we are at war with the drug cartels. Let's fight this war to win. Vote against the resolution that surrenders to the drug cartels. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I am proud and privileged to yield to the gentleman from Mississippi, Benny Thompson, the chair of the Homeland Security Committee. 1 minute.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Georgia for recognizing me. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the resolution. I was in West Texas this past weekend and saw nothing to justify the president's designation of a national emergency. There aren't gangs of violent criminals and terrorists overtaking our southern border, and if there was a crisis, it's hard to imagine a worse or less effective response than a border wall, which will take months, if not years, to build. What I did see there are efforts to harden ports of entry. In fact, just days before I arrived in El Paso, sharp barbed wire was installed in the middle of a busy port of entry. This barbed wire did not give off the impression that this busy port of entry was welcoming commerce or visitors to the United States. When questioned, officials could not say who had signed off on this project or how it fits into border security. It's time for the administration to stop fear-mongering and accept reality. The only crisis on the border is a humanitarian crisis, one created by this administration, and a border wall will do nothing to alleviate the suffering. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting for this resolution to stop the president from stripping Congress of its constitutional power to purse. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd yield an additional 1 minute to the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Gentlewoman from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to stop violent gangs like MS-13 from entering our cities and bringing their violence and evil onto our streets. We need to stop the drug smugglers from devastating our communities and flooding our towns with opioids like heroin and fentanyl. My home state of West Virginia has been hit hard by the opioid epidemic, and especially from illegal drugs smuggled across the border. Just several weeks ago, Customs and Border Protection seized enough fentanyl to kill every person in West Virginia 32 times over. Imagine how much more is still slipping through the unsecured areas. Our country cannot afford inaction any longer. We need to build this wall. I yield back the portion of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm proud to yield to the gentleman from Maryland and the distinguished majority leader of this House of Representatives, Steny Hoyer, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
It's a magic 1 minute. This issue is not about a wall. It is about the Constitution. It is about this institution. It is about the balance that we say is equal between the Article I institution and the Article II institution. That's important to remember. That is why this argument is so very important. But it is not about just a single policy. It is about the kind of government that our founding fathers instituted, which has been the envy of the world and the example to many. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend, Congressman Castro of Texas, and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus for introducing this resolution. I was at the border in California and in New Mexico just a few days ago. I was at the border in El Paso with my distinguished colleague, the former executive called judge of that area. She will speak shortly, and she will tell you, Ms. Escobar will say, there is no war at the border. There is no crisis at the border. She'll explain that better than I can. She lives there. Now, at the border, I saw a lot of heartbreak and challenge. But I did not see a national emergency that would justify the president ignoring the Constitution and trying to make funding decisions without congressional approval. That's the issue. And for my colleagues to say this is a partisan issue, let me call your attention to the statements of approximately 20 members of the United States Senate. The President admitted on February 15th that this is not a true emergency when he said, and I quote, "I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster." Not that I needed to do it much faster, I'd just rather do it much faster. Of course, if the Mexicans were paying for it, perhaps he could have. Now Congress has a chance to answer the President and make it clear that he cannot make an end run around the Constitution and claims power reserved for the taxpayers' representatives. Mr. Speaker, the Congress of the United States needs to have a spine and not lay at the feet of the President of the United States and say, "Whatever you want, sir." That's not what the people elected us to do. We are their representatives, not the President's representative, whether it's President Obama, President Trump, President Clinton, or President Bush, or President Reagan, all of whom I have served with, 2 Bushes. Our founding fathers had enough of King George. And so they adopted a constitution which said, we're not going to have a King George. We're not going to have an authoritarian regime. We're not going to have the executive setting policy. They said the Congress sets policy. And by the way, 300 of us in this body voted for the funding levels for border security. It didn't squeak by some partisan advantage. 300 of us, which is to say well over 66%. Now, Congress has a chance to answer the President and make it clear. He demanded that the American taxpayers give him billions for the wall that Democrats and Republicans alike say is expensive and ineffective. But again, this is not about the wall. This is about our Constitution and our institution and our self-respect. He has chosen to ignore the will of the American people as expressed by their representatives. He has opted to set aside the wisdom of our founders for the expedience of getting his own way. Constitutional law professor Roger Sloan of Boston University noted last week, to my knowledge, this is the professor speaking, to my knowledge, no president has ever tried to appropriate funds Congress refused to appropriate. Overwhelming Senate vote, overwhelming vote in this body. He went on to say, politically, it would mean the president would be seeking to override a bipartisan judgment of Congress. Have we no self-respect? Have we no sense of the balance between the executive and the legislative branches of government? We are the Article I branch, the policymakers, the people who raise money and spend money, not the president, any president, Republican or Democrat. And a lot of your Republican colleagues, including Senator McConnell, said, Mr. President, don't do this. Right up until the time Senator McConnell said, I'll support you, Mr. President. First, he was against this, and now he's for it. And the respected Harvard Law School constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe said of the president on Thursday, he is simply trying to do what emperors and kings do, not what a president of the United States should do. In the Washington Post this weekend, columnist Max Boot noted why we are now at a pivotal moment for members of the president's party in the Congress who are being asked to choose between loyalty to the president and fidelity to the Constitution. I'm sorry the chamber is not filled. I thought of asking for a quorum call. I didn't. Fidelity to the president or fidelity to the Constitution? That is the choice we make today. That is why this is a pivotal moment. We choose between the Constitution and its principles, which have made our country the world's envied democracy for almost 2.5 centuries. Boot continued with this: President Trump's actions is an affront to all that Republicans stand for. The premise is you continue to stand for this institution and our Constitution. They claim to be pro-military, but Trump's actions would take money away from the defense budget. They claim to be pro-property rights, but Trump's actions would result in taking of private property along the border. And they claim to be constitutional conservatives, but Trump's actions is an obvious violation of Article 1 of the Constitution, which says, and I quote, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law." I used to have people coming up here and take out the Constitution and say, "Have you read this document? Do you know what it says?" Let me repeat it. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of an appropriation made by law. Now, I've heard the scare rhetoric, and I suggest to you with all due respect, my colleagues, that kind of rhetoric has preceded every despot's takeover of power in the world. There was a crisis. They had to declare military law. They had to suspend the Constitution and suspend the laws. That's how despots take power. And we stand at the gate to assure that that doesn't happen. But we will say more with our votes. If we vote yes, we will say Congress is still the voice of the American people. We will say that we are still faithful to the oath we took to protect the Constitution and laws of our land. And we will say America, as our founders promised, has no sovereign but we, the people. We, not me, not I, we, the people. We must not allow the president to set a dangerous precedent, stripping Congress of its power of the purse. This is the first time. You can say there are a lot of other emergencies. That's correct. But this is unique. We must not allow him to set the precedent whereby any chief executive, Republican or Democrat, can declare an emergency anytime he or she doesn't agree with Congress's funding. This is not a partisan resolution. It is supported and encouraged by former and current Republican members who recognize how dangerous it would be for the Congress not to act. A group of 23 former Republican members of Congress have written to you, including former Senator Olympia Snowe, Dick Lugar, Chuck Hagel, and John Danforth. Sent a letter currently serving Republican members yesterday. In it, they wrote this: "It has always been a Republican fundamental principle excuse me, that no matter how strong our policy preferences, no matter how deep our loyalties to the President or party leaders, in order to remain a constitutional republic, we must act within the borders of the Constitution. Today, a conservative senator from North Carolina, a Republican conservative senator from North Carolina, said this: "I have great concerns when our institution looks the other way at the expense of weakening Congress's power." Senator Murkowski and Collins have already said they will support this resolution. So let us act, and do so in one powerful voice, not as Democrats, not as Republicans, as Americans, as representatives, as people who have put their faith in us to make a judgment to protect their country, their Constitution. As Americans who believe in our Constitution and the wisdom of our founders, who gave Congress alone the authority to appropriate funds and gave the representatives of the people and the states a powerful check on the executive. I ask all my Republican colleagues, how would you vote if Barack Obama were President of the United States today? Think of that. Because if you cannot answer, I would vote the same way, then you are not being true to your country, to our Constitution, and to your oath. If any member cares at all about the equal status of the Article I branch of the Constitution, he or she should vote for this resolution. Vote for conscience and Constitution, not party and politics. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, who just came back from deployment on the southern border.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to start by saying something. Everybody here in this chamber means well. Everybody here in this chamber believes they're fighting for the right thing for this country. Unfortunately, sometimes with these debates, they get heated and we begin to ascribe bad motives to the other side. I ascribe no bad motives to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And there's no bad motives on our side. It's just a little bit of a difference in how we see it. We're all passionate about this issue, which is evident by the quality of the debate we're having here. But I'm going to tell you why I came to believe that this was a national emergency. So I was sent down to the border with the National Guard. I went down and did 2 weeks with my unit, who was down there for 2 months. As part-timers, we go down and we fill in and augment different amounts of time. And I fly a surveillance aircraft. It's called an RC-26. And we actually worked with Border Patrol, and what we would do is, through technology, some of the technology that exists, they would get indications of a group coming over the border. We would have a central authority that would see these groups coming over the border and would take the limited air assets we had and put them on these groups to surveil them and then to coordinate the Border Patrol or whatever to come in and get them. And what we saw, frankly, was pretty eye-opening for me. Now, first off, Arizona has some very rugged territory. I've worked Texas, by the way, 3 times doing this exact same mission. I'm going to give you an opportunity to guess who the president was when I did this mission 3 other times. It was President Obama, because he understood the need for the Guard on the border. So we would see these groups come over. They would go through this rugged terrain. By the way, I never worked an area in Arizona where there was a barrier. We never had to, but there's a lot of area that isn't. We would then respond. And basically 9 times out of 10, anytime these groups got any indication that Border Patrol was nearby or there was an aircraft overhead, they would do what we call a bomb burst, just like that. Looks like that on the infrared we're using. They would run in all different directions. And many people would get separated. But you know who the first to bomb blast away from that group was? The first people every time were the coyotes that they paid their life savings to bring them over the border. Every time. In fact, one time that exact scenario happened and a lady was left lost in the desert, hunkered down in a bush, and had Border Patrol not found her, sure, she'll be deported for that because she came in illegally, but had Border Patrol not found her, I believe that there is a chance that she could have been one of the at least 200 bodies that they find every year in the desert because they are abandoned by their drug traffickers, by their coyotes who are paid for and who pay money to the drug cartels. That's a big part of where these cartels in Mexico get their money, funneling people over the border, human trafficking. We know the statistics of the chance of assault during that. We know that kind of stuff. We also had, it wasn't my mission, but my crew was on a mission, their very first one, where a illegal was apprehended and he had 70 pounds of methamphetamine on him. Now, I know there's way more than 70 pounds of methamphetamine out there in the United States, but there's way more people we're not seeing come over that border as well. People sometimes look at the rugged terrain of Arizona and say, well, with mountains and hills, that is the natural wall. By the way, I went hiking on those mountains and hills during my time off, I'll say that. But the other interesting thing is a significant amount of the people we were following were actually on those mountains and hills. They were on the mountains and hills because that rugged terrain is just as difficult for Border Patrol to navigate as them. In fact, I watched as a Border Patrol helicopter followed a man probably 100 feet away. This is on video. Border Patrol can release this video if they want. The man was running. The Border Patrol could not insert Border Patrol agents to capture him. This guy is still gone today. He had to have been a coyote or a drug trafficker. Seeing this repeatedly made me realize this is not a national emergency because of immigration. I'm actually believe in comprehensive immigration reform. I want to work with the other side of the aisle to fix all these problems that I think we really actually all agree on. We just can't admit we agree on all this stuff. But I look at this and I say, this is an 80% solution that we could fix. But when I came back from the border, and I came back from seeing the real issue that makes this a national emergency, drugs, human trafficking, that's when I realized something had to be done. A wall and a barrier is not compassionless. I think border security and compassion actually go hand in hand. Because what we're saying is, come over to the United States of America, but do it the right and legal way, because otherwise these coyotes in the cartel are going to take advantage of you, take your life savings, and take you through a very dangerous route, and when the going gets tough, they're going to leave you to die, because they did that to 200 of them last year in Arizona. It was an eye-opening experience. I appreciate the passion everybody has in this. I respect everybody's debate in this. This is how I came to the conclusion I did. Please vote no on this, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It amuses me when my friends on the other side try to cause the public to believe that there are people coming across our border trying to sneak in, when the truth of the matter is the people who are presenting themselves at our southern border primarily are people fleeing violence in Central America, families, women, children, fleeing violence in Central America, presenting themselves at lawful points of entry, not trying to jump the Rio Grande, but at lawful points of entry and seeking to apply for asylum. And that is the emergency that my friends on the other side tried to make into something that would be such that President Trump is authorized to spend monies that have not been appropriated. And it's a farce. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I will yield to the gentleman and my colleague, my dear colleague from the state of Georgia, John Lewis, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution. Some of you may be old enough to remember when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Berlin in 1964, he reminded those gathered that a man-made barrier could not change the fact that the people on both sides of the wall was God's children. Mr. Speaker, I ask you today, what does it profit our nation to gain a wall and lose our soul? North and south of the border, we are one people. We're bound together. by our common humanity. Mr. Speaker, this executive action betrays our value, our democracy, and the very soul of our nation. As members of Congress and the nation are immigrants, we have a constitutional mission and a mandate to preserve the balance of power and to oppose this monument to hate. Today, each and every one of us has a moral obligation to do what is right, what is just, what is fair. By passing this resolution, I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire is the time remaining?
Gentleman from Missouri has 7 3/4 minutes remaining. Has 11.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this point, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much, Mr. Graves. Today I've heard a lot of amazing things. My colleague on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Johnson from Georgia, said, I believe caravans trying to cross the border are a figment of our imagination. I don't know about you, but I think all we need to do is turn on the news. I've seen thousands of people traipsing thousands of miles to get into our country. In fact, there's been some violence, so I just don't understand that statement at all. And Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer recently said the crisis at the border is manufactured. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I live in the state of Arizona, a border state, and I have visited the border, and I have met with the border agents and border officials at the border. They have told me firsthand there is a crisis at the border. They have told me firsthand when I asked, do we need a border fence? And they said, yes, it is part of the solution. You know, I'm here today to ask for a reason. The Republican legislature and the majority last year tried to pass legislation that would not only secure the border, but as a compromise would have given legal status to the DACA recipients. Not one Democrat voted for it. Can we please get together and solve this problem? It's unfortunate that the president had to resort to this because Congress, the Democrats, would not vote for border security. And so I support the president in his declaration for emergency. I support him in protecting our nation, his #1 duty. And I oppose this resolution.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recall that last year, in fact, the last 2 years have been spent under unified control of Republicans, both houses of Congress and the president, but yet there was no emergency to construct a $5 billion down payment on a border wall that's going to cost about $30 billion. They didn't do it then. They want us to do it now, or they want Trump to actually be able to do it without the legislature. Mr. Speaker, at this time I will yield to the gentle lady, Veronica Escobar from the great state of Texas. 1 minute.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come from El Paso, Texas, which is right on the U.S.-Mexico border. I live on the border. My family has lived on the border for more than 100 years. And I can assure my colleagues that the border has never been safer, the border has never been more secure. In fact, what I am more worried about today than what is happening on the U.S.-Mexico border, than those vulnerable asylum seekers coming to our front door asking for help, I am more worried that people in this chamber are willing to ignore the oath of office that we took on the day that we were sworn in, that we would violate the Constitution that we promised to uphold. And I am also far more worried about the fact that they are willing to divert funding that is going to our U.S. military in favor of a political prop, a monument to xenophobia, a campaign promise. In fact, Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, stands to potentially lose $275 million. Why didn't they get it done when they had an iron grip over the House, the Senate, and the White House? Because there was no emergency. I yield.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we take the oath of office to defend the Constitution. The Constitution applies to citizens of the United States. It does not apply to people who are not citizens of the United States. Border security officers have made 266,000 arrests of criminal aliens in the last 2 fiscal years. These include criminal aliens charged or convicted of assaults, sex crimes, killings. Mr. Speaker, these are not victimless crimes. With that, I would reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, I am pleased to yield to my good friend from the state of California, Mr. Cisneros. 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This emergency declaration unconstitutionally attempts to override Congress. The Constitution clearly grants Congress the power of the purse. This declaration took place after weeks of negotiations, which resulted in Congress rejecting the President's wall in a bipartisan manner. This declaration could take billions of dollars of disaster relief aid from families, endanger military construction, and impact our military readiness. There is no national emergency at the southern border, only a humanitarian crisis created by our President. This President has repeatedly taken actions that undermines our country's ability to defend against real threats to national security. Congress must act as a check on the President's abuse of executive power. Congress has the opportunity to defend and protect the Constitution and assert its role as a co-equal branch of government, and it must do so in order to set a precedent and protect our democracy. It is absolutely unacceptable that military families and communities across this country should be made to suffer from this unlawful and dangerous action. That is why I urge my colleagues to vote in support of this resolution and move forward with ending this fake national emergency. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time?
Gentleman from Georgia has 9 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Missouri has 5 1/4 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will at this time yield to my good friend, the gentle lady from Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
How much time?
1 minute and 30 seconds.
The gentleman yields 1 1/2 minutes. The gentleman from Florida, gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we are witnessing is a president who poses a direct threat to both our military families and America's national security. First, as we've heard, there is no border emergency. That is a fabrication. The administration's own statistics show that crossings and apprehensions are at a historic low. The vast majority of illegal drugs come in at our ports of entry. A wall will not stop that. Many who cross our borders are women and children. They're not running from border agents. They're seeking them out for help and for asylum. Second, this will make life harder for America's military families and thus hurt our national security. Who would ever intentionally make life tougher for the brave men and women who serve our country? It's monstrous, really, when you think about the sacrifices that they already make for this country. As the chair of the Military Construction VA Appropriations Subcommittee, tomorrow I will hold a hearing to ask our service secretaries exactly which projects they previously told us they really needed, but now should be sacrificed for a needless wall. What will these leaders ask their troops to give up, just so Trump can have a useless, wasteful wall? Training or intelligence facilities? Hangars for planes that cost billions? Schools for our military families' children? This is a power grab. After failing to get his way in a funding dispute with Congress, Trump is throwing an unconstitutional temper tantrum. He's using the tools of an authoritarian, jeopardizing our military readiness to steal himself a wall that he could not get the lawful way. The dangerous precedent he will set is one that I hope all of my Republican colleagues will reject. The President says a wall will keep Americans safe, but stealing funds from military families makes us all less safe. Bypassing Congress and the Constitution and starving military families of funding is not patriotism. It's everything that true patriots fight against. I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded not to engage in personalities concerning the President. The gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we keep hearing that most drugs coming into this country are coming in at ports of entry. And I would make a correction. Most drugs that are caught at ports of entry. We don't have any idea what's coming in across the border. And when we say that, you know, this is like saying we're going to reinforce the front door, but we're going to leave the back door wide open. We don't know how many drugs or the amount of drugs that are coming across the border because, particularly in rural areas, because we just simply can't patrol it. As the gentleman from Illinois pointed out, you can't deploy Border Patrol quick enough to catch so much of this. So we don't know how many drugs are coming through in other areas. We have a pretty good idea in ports of entry because we catch them there. With that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's hard for me to imagine how a big, beautiful wall will somehow bestow upon us knowledge that people are jumping over it or going under it. Those kinds of things do not work across the entire border. That may have its place at some points, and I'm sure we have border wall and border fencing in the locations where it is necessary. But in the other locations, we need, in addition to more Border Patrol officers who are paid a living wage, we need the technology and the other assets that can surveil and help with the apprehension of people who are coming across the border at points that are not legal points of entry. But the point is, today's crisis that faces the people of Central America and drives them to our southern border is driving them to lawful points of entry to seek asylum protection under this nation's laws, and that is something that they are entitled to. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I will yield 1 minute and 30 seconds to the gentle lady from the great state of Texas, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, the only crisis is the constitutional crisis that has been created by the President of the United States by his direct and ill-conceived abuse of power, which is noted in the Constitution as a violation of the Constitution. It is sad that the President has declared a national emergency for the purpose of misappropriating funds from previously designated and important uses to build a wall. Uses that would be dealt with in a national emergency in case of war that would then call for the building of direct materials and buildings necessary for troops engaging in war. The only response to my good friend who has come back from the border and saw people going over the border is to engage more Border Patrol agents and train them to do the job that they're designated to do. We as Democrats support that. Illegal border crossings are at near 40-year low. 60 national security personnel, ambassadors, CIA, DNI, and others have indicated that this is wrong-headed. It is wrong. The President's declaration clearly violates the Congress' exclusive power of the purse, and if unchecked, would fundamentally alter the balance of powers, violating our founders' vision for America. That is unconstitutional. To quote Thomas Paine, in Common Sense, the absolute governments, the king is law. In absolute governments, the king is law. So in free countries, the law ought to be the king. This is the abuse, the declaration, and we should vote for the underlying resolution to restore constitutional order.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield to the gentlelady an additional minute.
I thank the gentleman very much.
The gentlewoman is recognized for an additional minute.
To restore constitutional order. Let me also indicate that as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, the numbers of Mexicans from Mexico has decreased. The numbers coming now are what we call OTMs, other than Mexico. They are coming and fleeing bloodshed in countries where they're being threatened with the decapitation of their head. Mothers being told that if you stay, we know you're pregnant, you can have the baby and we'll kill you after your birth. These are the stories that those of us who visited the border over and over again are hearing. If there is a crisis, it is a humanitarian crisis. But we as Democrats have no problem with funding the resources necessary for the border, including, as indicated, the increase in personnel, technology, and transportation equipment. I have been to the border when the need for night goggles and other types of equipment were rendered important. Let us do the right thing, vote on this resolution, and do the constitutional point of restoring order to this government. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, make a point of clarification, because the statement was made that individuals from outside this country coming to ports of entry seeking asylum are entitled to that. No one outside this country is entitled to anything in this country. They can be heard, but they're not entitled to asylum in the United States just because they ask for it, just because they seek it. They aren't entitled to anything within this country. And with that, I would balance my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that most learned colleagues in this chamber understand that under U.S. law, we have granted persons approaching our border the right to apply for asylum. That doesn't mean that asylum will be granted, but they certainly have a right to apply for it. It's the humane thing to do in a civilized society. This is the law that America has proceeded under for centuries. And now we have a naked power grab by the chief executive of this great nation, the President of the United States, seeking to do the job of the legislative branch and his own job, but there's a problem. It's only the legislative branch that appropriates funding for various occurrences. And the legislative branch has not given this president what he has sought. That is a down payment on a border wall, which is a monument to a campaign promise that he made. This legislature has not given him that authority, and so in a naked power grab, he's seeking to do it by declaring an emergency when in fact no emergency exists. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I am pleased to yield to the gentlelady from Washington, D.C., my friend, a staunch advocate for the people of Washington, D.C., none other than my good friend Eleanor Holmes Norton, for 1 minute.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I don't even want to speak to the underlying issue. I want to speak to what it is we are doing here. The president signed a bill. He didn't have to. He could have retained his power. Now he proposes to ignore the bill he signed and act as if the Congress did not exist. This is the road to dictatorship. The Congress cannot ever agree with an executive that takes our power. That is what this bill does. We have gradually given our power, sometimes for expedience sakes, sometimes to avoid controversy. Today, we are on notice that we will not give the power that belongs only to the Congress to the President of the United States. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Yeah, can I inquire the remaining time?
Yes, gentleman from Missouri has 4 minutes. Gentleman from Georgia has a minute and a quarter.
I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Missouri reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you. At this time, I yield to the gentle lady from California and also the Speaker of this great House, as much time, for 1 minute, the Honorable Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for the eloquent way that he has presented this legislation to the floor of the House. Mr. Speaker, I rise to quote from the Constitution of the United States. It begins with our statement of purpose of the nation, with the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Immediately following that sacred purpose says Article 1. Article 1, the legislative branch. Perhaps it's time for our country to have a civics lesson, a values-based civics lesson. I applaud our colleague, Congressman Castro, for his leadership in ensuring that this House was ready to reassert our responsibility under the Constitution in its systems of checks and balances. In their wisdom, our founders rejected the idea of a monarch. They didn't want to live under that. They made that clear. They fought a war of independence to free themselves from that. And therefore, in their wisdom, they put forth in this Constitution a heart and soul and core of it, the separation of powers, co-equal branches of government to be a check and balance on each other. They saw the wisdom of that and then, of course, added the Bill of Rights with further freedoms enumerated. But the core of the Constitution is the separation of power. So today, we are on this floor of the House, and our colleagues have spoken eloquently about the reality or mythology of the crisis at the border that the President contends. They've spoken eloquently about the opportunity cost of the money that the President wants to use for this ill-conceived wall and what it means to our national security. But we in this House of Representatives, each one of us and everyone in public service in our country takes an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It is our oath. We promise. And that Constitution is about the separation of powers that is being usurped by the executive branch. We in the legislative branch cannot let that happen. And in fact, I appeal to our Republican colleagues because I do believe and trust that they are people of their word. And if they take an oath to uphold the Constitution, that they will honor it with their vote on the floor today. In keeping, by the way, with under previous House Speaker, our colleagues across the aisle placed a high priority on the separation of powers and Congress's constitutional prerogatives. The Republican Better Way, which they put forth in 2014, that agenda read, and I follow, quote, "The people granted Congress the power to write laws, raise revenues, and spend and borrow money on behalf of the United States." They continue, "There is no power more consequential, yet for decades Congress has let this power atrophy, thereby depriving the people of their voice." Their Better Way goes on to say, "The founders insisted on a separation of powers to protect our constitutional liberties." Their proposal goes on to say that James Madison warned that, quote, warned that the Constitution is a mere parchment barrier unless each branch asserted its powers to keep the other in check. That is all in the Republican agenda for a better way of 2014. So you would think it would be in keeping with their vote today. In that spirit, the then Speaker Ryan often lamented that Congress, quote, keeps forfeiting the game, yielding to the executive branch, giving the president a blank check, not even bothering to read the fine print in some cases. Well, we are not going to give any president, Democratic or Republican, a blank check to shred the Constitution of the United States. We would be delinquent in our duties as members of Congress if we did not overturn what the president is proposing. He is asking each and every one of us to turn our backs on the oath of office that we took to the Constitution of the United States. I do not believe that the Republicans want to do that. I don't think it's consistent with what they have advocated in the near term and historically. Is your oath of office to Donald Trump, or is your oath of office to the Constitution of the United States? You cannot let him undermine the strength of your pledge to protect and defend the Constitution. Again, our colleagues have talked about the opportunity cost of taking money from our national security and spending it in this way. I was at the border this weekend. We all have our stories and the rest, but whatever you think about the wall, let's just put that aside for a moment. And whatever you think about where you take the money from and where you put it, which is substantial, but putting that aside for a moment. The question is, what do you think about yourself, your Congress, your conscience, your oath of office? Your oath of office. And I trust that our colleagues, as I say, will be consistent in their beliefs and join us in honoring the oath we all take to support. The resolution is not about politics. It's not about partisanship. It's about patriotism. It's about the Constitution of the United States, which I hold in my hand here. And George Washington on the cover of this says, "Its only keepers, the people." We in the People's House are the keepers of this Constitution. We in the Congress are the keepers of this Constitution. We in this Congress are in Article 1, the Congress of the United States, spelled out very clearly in the Constitution the powers given to the legislative branch, the powers of the purse, the power to declare war, powers enumerated very carefully by our founders. How can you ignore that? And so I urge a strong bipartisan support of this vital resolution to honor our oath, to bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution. True faith and allegiance to the Constitution. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of the time. Members are reminded that all comments will be referred to the chair. This time, the gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the majority, are they prepared to close?
We have no further witnesses, and we're prepared to close.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Speaker.
from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Don't you think find it ironic, I guess, and actually it's kind of ludicrous that we talk so much about how much this wall is going to cost and how inhumane it is and how immoral it is, and yet we build thousands and thousands of miles and spend millions and millions of dollars on noise abatement wall in our suburbs and our urban areas all over the country, 30 feet high, 20 feet high, all over the country, but yet we can't do something to protect our border. That's not a crisis, Mr. Speaker. This is a crisis. What we're talking about today is a crisis. President Obama agreed when he requested emergency funding in 2014 to deal with the crisis on the border. And when he declared a national emergency because of transnational drug traffickers. Since fiscal year 2012, Customs and Border Patrol has seized 4 million pounds of drugs at ports of entry, more than 11 million pounds of drugs between ports of entry. Nearly 3 times as many drugs are seized between ports, Mr. Speaker. Many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle recognize the need for a border wall. Voting to authorize a wall in 2006 and again under President Obama in 2013. And last year we passed bipartisan legislation to address the growing impacts of opioids in our communities, drugs that continue to flow into our country through our southern border. We all agreed on a bipartisan basis that there was a crisis, but now suddenly they're calling this a manufactured crisis. The National Emergencies Act is clear, Mr. Speaker. The President's authority is clear. The President is acting within the authority that Congress has given him. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would urge a no vote on this resolution, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
From Missouri yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In approving the joint resolution terminating President Trump's illegal power grab, the House will make clear that nothing is more fundamental to the functioning of our democracy than the separation of powers among the 3 co-equal branches of government. The facts are clear. President Trump failed to convince a skeptical Congress to pay for an ineffective border wall. Instead, I urge now my colleagues to support this resolution, but I must ask you to ask yourself this question: will you allow your solemn vow of loyalty to President Trump to override your oath of office and your vow of fidelity to the Constitution?
Gentleman's
Vote
time has expired.
and support this resolution. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 144, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the engrossment and third reading on the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution relating to a national emergency declared by the President on February 15th, 2019.
The question is on the passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, may inquires the Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.